You done with your Oreo?
Yeah, done with my Oreo.
Okay, good.
Do we really know what happened?
The brother did.
The brother, that's what I thought too.
I mean, that seems like kind of obvious.
Hey, do you want to talk about death?
Yeah. I mean,
Murdery thingy.
Hey everybody, it's Mario. I just wanted to tell you quickly that I made a little goof and said the wrong name of the author in the book that I mentioned as one of my main sources. I put a little insert of me saying it, but it sounds weird, so just so you know, that's why that sounds weird. Enjoy the episode. I already started it.
Oh.
Hey.
Hi.
Hi.
Hey. Today's been a long day.
Yeah.
Let's get started. I'm excited.
Right? Okay, cool. So, welcome to Mystery Murdery
Welcome
Thingy.
to Mystery Murdery Thingy. My name is Chloe.
My name is Mario.
That's Mario.
Okay.
I'm Chloe.
This is going to be a whiz-bang kind of episode. We're
Whiz
getting it
bang.
done. We've been getting a lot of stuff done today, moving stuff.
This is the last thing.
Chloe's leaving in a few hours, so we got to get this done. Okay.
Coming home.
Leaving on an Amtrak train.
Yeah.
Okay, so who's going to go first?
I think you should go first.
Okay, I'll go first.
All right.
Okay, so I am going to talk about, as we mentioned last episode, about right, and I decided not to edit it out. So I'm going to talk about the moon. How did the moon come to be? Our friendly gray friend in the sky.
The moon is scary.
Is it?
What's your moon sign?
I don't know what that means.
You have a sun sign and a moon sign.
Oh,
I know your sun sign is
it's probably
Scorpio.
like the peace sign. Is that one?
Keep going.
Okay. I saw the sign. So people have been obviously looking up at the moon, contemplate what the hell is this thing? How did it come to be, right? Ever since there have been people, right? For 2 million years or more. But, in modern times, we've kind of, solved a lot of the mysteries of the moon, right? It's not made of cheese. Weird, right?
What would it be like to be an early human? Do you have any, stories of, what they thought the moon was?
Well, I don't necessarily have too much of that, but what I would say, one of my main sources is a book called The Book of the Moon by Maggie Adarin Pocock. And she did research. One of her interests is ancient astronomy. So I'd say if you want more info on that, look up that book. But what I'm going to talk about is more kind of the modern idea of how the moon came to be. So, like I said, we've figured out a lot of the mysteries about the moon and stuff, right? But not everything by any means. And the exact origin of the moon is still very much a mystery. So over time, there have been many different hypotheses, some of which are very much discredited now, as to how the moon came to be. One of them that was I think Charles Darwin's son or grandson or something purported, or maybe other people, I can't remember, was that the early Earth was spinning so fast while it was molten that it threw off
A piece of itself?
Right, and that became the moon.
But why
we think that that's not really what happened.
Oh, okay.
For technical reasons that I will not get into.
Okay.
One of my favorite phrases that I don't use enough. Gets you out of anything. For technical reasons that I will not get into. So, thank you.
And I would like you to assume that I can get into them perfectly.
I could explain that. I'm just not wearing the right shoes. So, is that a good... That's a bad joke. That's not a good joke.
Keep going.
Okay, cool.
Cool. No doubt.
No doubt. So, there are, though, a few of these hypotheses that have survived into the modern era. So one idea is that the moon was kind of a free-floating body, right? Doing its own thing. Billions of years ago. More than 4.5 billion years ago. Wow. And that it was captured by the Earth's gravitational pull. So that was kind of the most popular theory up until about the 1980s.
Oh.
So, though, or part of why it was so popular, right, is because we basically know that this is how some other moons, like some of the moons of Jupiter and Saturn, came to be around, their planets, that they were captured. And the moon's size and the orbit of the moon, and the fact that it's tidally locked, right? That it's always facing us the same way. There's a light side and a dark side of the moon.
Which is weird.
All of that kind of fits in with the capture theory. But it was never super clear how the physics of the capture would have worked. object. Usually when an encounter happens, right, between two, like, pretty, large bodies that are, roughly about the same size, there's either a collision or the two bodies' orbits are just kind of altered, but they don't end up getting caught, right? That like apparently almost never happens. So it's like very, very unlikely in and of itself. Unless you're talking about like Jupiter, right, which captures like a shit ton of stuff all the time. But the Earth is not that big, right? So it was hypothesized that a large atmosphere around the early Earth could have slowed down a moon-sized object by this process called aerobraking, right? Which is sort of this way that you can go through an atmosphere where the forces aren't so much that it like tears you apart, right? The shear forces, but that the forces are enough that it slows you down. And sort of brings you into... If you watch certain Star Trek The Next Generation episodes, you'll understand what I mean. So I would go to Star Trek The Next Generation for more info. Nerd alert, nerd alert. So this process of aerobraking also seems to have happened with some of the moons of Jupiter and Saturn. Because they're like gas giants.
Did Earth like used to have a bigger atmosphere, and you're saying that bigger atmosphere took in?
It's a hypothesis.
Oh, okay.
And one of the things that I'll talk about is that the nature of early Earth, of proto-Earth, is actually itself a mystery. Like, we have some ideas, but we don't really know. And that kind of plays into some of this. So the real killer, though, for the capture hypothesis was that certain isotope ratios, basically like chemical signatures, quote unquote, so to speak, in rocks, right, are like identical between the Earth and the Moon. And this is really hard to explain.
That's weird.
If the Moon formed somewhere else, it's extremely unlikely that it would happen to have these same, isotope ratios between like the Moon rocks and the Earth rocks. So this theory seems to not be supported by evidence, really.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, the capture hypothesis, it's almost disproven at this point. At least there's really no evidence that suggests that it is true. So the opposite of the capture hypothesis is called the accretion hypothesis. So this holds that the Earth and the Moon were formulated at the same time out of two disks of accreting material. So the early solar system, right, you've got the sun, and the sun is just pulling like all this stuff, right? But the stuff is also pulling each other, so it creates these like little eddies. If you look in a waterfall and there's like a big log sitting in the middle of the waterfall, right, you'll see a big swirl around the log, but you'll see these other swirls as well as other stuff kind of gets affected.
That was a good analogy.
Thank you so much. So this is essentially how planets typically get formed. There's an accretion disk that forms, and then materials kind of coalesce and create this gravity well to where it creates like a planet. So that also could happen simultaneously with the Moon. However, this hypothesis does not explain certain things that we see, right? Certain evidence that's like just there in nature. So particularly it does not explain the angular momentum in the Earth-Moon system, the way that the two bodies move one against the other.
The tides and stuff like that?
That's exactly right. And we typically think about this, and one of the more direct impacts it has on us and the Earth is the tides, for sure. And Maggie Adarin Pocock gets into this in the book in like a lot of detail, but essentially the way that the angular momentum between the Earth and the Moon happens, well, first of all, it creates a different type of tides than would occur if it weren't the case, right? If they were just like perfectly locked in together in this orbital pattern. Secondly, the Moon is actually moving away from the Earth by about an inch a year, I think, which is really fast.
I was gonna say. Yeah,
it's like a centimeter a year, inch a year. I can't really remember. I know that's kind of a big difference, or not. I don't know. But it has been ever since the beginning, right? So we know that the Earth and the Moon, for example, at the beginning were not tidally locked. The Earth was spinning much more quickly, and the Moon was spinning much more quickly. And over time, as the analogy that Maggie Adarin Pocock uses, which is I think a really good one too, is spinning ice skaters. Okay. So if you've ever watched ice skating, as the two skaters get closer to each other, they move faster. Oh, and even one skater when they bring their arms in, right? And as they get further away, there's more angular moment or less angular momentum. I'm not really sure. Whatever happens to make them slow down. Right? Science happens. Physics, right? I don't understand it. Rip Murray Gell-Mann, by the way, famous quantum physicist who just died. But anyway, this process goes through, right, to such an extent to where the moon's way out there and it's tidally locked instead of being spinning really fast and being much closer in. So we kind of know that about what happened. And the accretion hypothesis would not explain that. Like, it would not be that way if the moon and the Earth had just formed together out of these two kind of like parallel disks of accreting material. And it also, the accretion hypothesis also doesn't explain why the moon has a relatively small iron core. If the moon formed basically the same way the Earth did, you'd expect it to have a similarly sized iron core, but it's about half the size. The ratio of it to the moon is about half of what the ratio of the Earth's iron core is to the Earth, if you understand.
Yes.
The 50% of the Earth about is an iron core, 25% about of the moon is an iron core, so that's not really explained by the accretion hypothesis. So the most popular hypothesis that we have now is called the giant impact hypothesis. And it's like a pretty popular idea. You may have heard about this. You know, this object, purported object called Theia, that is supposed to have hit the early Earth early on, and basically that impact and the material that was, jettisoned out from the early Earth is essentially what created the moon. And I'll get into a little bit more detail here.
So, I don't know if you're about to answer this, but I know you talk about, like, celestial bodies, like, colliding. Mm-hmm. How quick does that happen?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question.
Like, and instantly, or is it like other space stuff, which is really, really slow?
I guess the idea of slow and fast, when you're talking astronomically, it sort of gets confused. Like,
okay, then put it in terms of a day, of like an Earth day.
I'm not sure, but it's not really known. Like, one of the mysteries is what would the speed of this purported impact have been. Oh, some people think that it may have been about 4.5 kilometers per second. But, how fast is 4.5 kilometers per second? It's really fast. It's extremely fast, right? If you're going 4 kilometers per second in a car, that's not possible. That's essentially faster than you'd break the land speed record many times over, right?
Yeah.
But if you're talking about, for example, the speed of light, it's like essentially standing still. It's nothing. So again, like you sort of have to adjust your. I don't know. It's hard to say.
Space is confusing.
Yes, but for an astronomical body, that would be about a medium speed, is what it said. So, but no one knows. Other people think it might have been significantly faster than that. So, it's one of the big mysteries.
So many
here.
questions.
Many questions. Embrace the mystery. Astronomical mysteries. Yeah. So it's posited that this purported astronomical body, right, Theia, about the size of Mars, struck the early Earth about 4.5 billion years ago. Billion years ago. This was only,
wow.
I know, right? Only about 20 to 100 million years after the solar system began to form. So really, really early on.
Oh.
And this is, this purported object. The reason why it's called Theia is because that's the name of the Greek Titan who birthed Selene, the Greek goddess of the moon. So in Greek, Selene is the moon, and Theia would be this, sort of mother of the moon, right? And while, the details of this are still very much a mystery, there is a fair amount of evidence for the giant impact hypothesis, more than the others, for sure. And here's a list that I got from Wikipedia.
Wikipedia.
Thank you, Wikipedia. And there are sources for it in the page. Earth's spin and the moon's orbit have similar orientations, which you would expect if it started right by this impact. Moon samples indicate that the moon's surface was once molten, which not too many other ways that could have happened other than a large impact. The moon has a relatively small iron core, we already talked about. The moon has a lower density than Earth. There is evidence in other star systems of similar collisions resulting in debris disks. Giant collisions are consistent with the leading theories of the formation of the solar system, and the stable isotope ratios of the lunar and terrestrial rock are essentially identical, implying some kind of common origin. And I'll talk about how that common origin may have come to be with the two objects. We'll tease that out a little bit here in just a minute. So let's talk about some things that remain a mystery. First, it's not known whether the possible impact was kind of a full-on, right, head-to-head kind of impact, or if it was more glancing, right? If it was more full-on, then it would result in a fuller mixture of the two bodies. If it was more glancing, then it would leave a lot of Theia intact, and Theia may have just like kept going with less material. Some computer simulations, and this is kind of what I was talking about earlier, suggest an impact angle of about 45 degrees. So kind of like, coming together, right at sort of a vortex, right? If you want to think about it like two cars, right? A car coming down a road and then a road perpendicular running a stop sign or something and then hitting each other. As opposed to like a head-on collision, right? And that the impact velocity may have been at or about or below 4 kilometers per second. The oxygen isotope ratios of the lunar rocks, though, and we've kind of mentioned this a few times, right? And some of these analyses were done pretty recently and like strengthened this idea of the homogeneity of the isotope ratios, the sameness, like that it seems like they came from the same material, suggest that a total mixing occurred between Theia and the Earth. So the head-on impact version of the giant impact hypothesis seems to be more correct, and that the likelihood that these ratios would just happen to be the same, right, is extremely low. So it seems like this is essentially how this probably happened, with a head-on impact that created this fuller mixture. So that the impact would have essentially turned Theia and Earth into a Theia-Earth mixture. Into a molten... you can't see my dancing.
Can't see us dancing.
I know, right?
We're both dancing.
It's so we're so cool. Into a molten liquid, right? That just not Theia anymore, not Earth anymore. It's just one molten mass of Theia-Earth material that would have been connected by this kind of vaporous atmosphere that would have encouraged this sort of large-scale mixing between the two bodies. And this would have created a homogenized, magma that would then have these homogenized isotope ratios that we find today.
So that's the moon.
Well, the moon would have been, materials, and I'll talk about that in just a second here. So, like the physics of it, I'll talk about in just a second. So, for this to have been possible, the mixing would have had to have continued for about 100 years, and scientists are trying to kind of figure out whether this was kind of possible. So, this is something we might get more answers about in the near future from the kind of theoreticians. So anyway, the massive impact of Theia would have mixed the core and most of the mantle of the two bodies. The cores would have been completely mixed. Some of the mantle, though, would have been thrust out into space. And this is where what you were asking before, right? Where's the moon in all of this, right?
Oh, okay.
The moon would have come from mantle material that, would have had a sufficient escape velocity to exit the main, mass of this material, right, and get trapped in orbit around them, the central material, right, the Proto-Earth Theia mixture now, and of course some of this material would have gotten thrust out and started orbiting the sun, but some of it would have had a median velocity between an orbital and an escape velocity, and that's the material that would have created the moon. Now,
wow, that's very... How does someone come up with that? How does one come to such a conclusion?
Theorists and astronomers and, people who make models, it's a lot of people. Thousands and thousands of people over a long period of time. It's not easy, but when you think about it, it's not that hard to understand either, right?
Yeah.
Two relatively large bodies hit each other. This causes them to melt, and they spin around real fast, and some of the material comes off and creates the moon. That's essentially what this is saying, right? In simplistic, very, very simplistic terms. So, scientists, right, think that the material would have formed into the moon maybe as quickly as a month, or maybe as much as a century. Both of which are very, very short amounts of time.
That's a pretty big gap.
It's a pretty big gap, but if you're talking about astronomical time, it's very, very close in time, and they're both exceedingly short. Computer simulations suggest that about 20% of the original mass of Theia would have been ejected and stayed in orbit. So the moon, as we know it now, would have been about 20% of that, right, Theia object that hit the proto-Earth, which itself was about the size of Mars.
Okay.
So, and again, this is all kind of worked out, over long periods of time, theory and, what we see in reality.
Where did Theia go?
Well, that's the thing, right? We don't know if it was the full-on impact.
If
then
Theia exists.
If Theia even existed, then Theia would now become part of the Earth, right? It became part of the proto-Earth and part of the moon. It just mixed in with the proto-Earth material.
So
okay. it didn't really go anywhere. It's still here.
So it wasn't like a hit and run?
That's what we think. Now, there could have been. That's what I mentioned earlier with whether it was a full-on blow or a glancing blow. Remember, and I said some of it could have kept going. So we don't know. That may have also happened. So there may also have been two moons at the beginning.
I wish we had two moons. You
Wouldn't
hear me say that all the time.
Anyway, one would have been significantly smaller. And you know how we talked earlier about how the moon started much closer in and then migrated out?
Yeah.
Okay. So as the moon migrated out, the smaller object would have gotten accreted probably pretty slowly onto what we now know as the dark side of the moon. And we essentially can see this. On the dark side of the moon, the crust is significantly thicker, and there are fewer of these I forget what they call them, but the crust is just it's much thicker on the other side, and it looks different. So we know essentially that something happened, and it may have been this smaller object that got slowly accreted onto that side.
Did we go to the dark side of the moon?
That's a very good question. Actually, the first man-made object to ever visit the dark side of the moon happened very recently. It was the Chang'e 4 lander. Well, maybe that's it's a lander and a rover that are part of one thing from the Chinese Space Agency. So man actually just visited the dark side of the moon for the first time a few months ago.
I'm glad I said something.
Yeah, no, definitely. But the first pictures of the dark side of the moon was probably, I think, in the 70s, or I can't remember if it was before Apollo 11 or after. I honestly, I can't remember. Anyway, there was a recent modification to the giant impact hypothesis called the terrestrial magma ocean hypothesis. And so this hypothesis posits that the early, proto-Earth at that time was covered by a worldwide magma ocean. And you remember I mentioned earlier, we don't really know what things were like back then. So this is kind of one idea. So when Theia struck this, worldwide magma ocean, it would have heated that magma up, much to a much larger extent than the relatively cool Theia material, which would have come in as solid, cool material. Thus, it would have, created this large, temperature disparity that would have ejected much more of the proto-Earth magma into orbit, therefore changing sort of the nature of that material. These the simulations they did based on this hypothesis suggest that the moon would have been made about 80% from mostly proto-Earth material, as opposed to prior models that suggested that the moon came from about 80% Theia, mainly Theia material. So this could help to explain some of this mystery of the isotope ratios, right? Maybe we just haven't looked in enough lunar rocks to find that Theia material because it's relatively rare, as opposed to the early Earth material, which would, of course, have the same isotope ratios as the current Earth.
Then why, like, physically is the moon so different?
I'm not sure what do you mean? That's like a really big question.
Like you said, they have the Earth and the moon have the same isotope ratios, right? Does that mean anything? Does that have anything to do with how it, like, looks, or what exactly
no, not really.
forms? Oh, okay.
Yeah, not necessarily. I mean, a lot of the difference in the way that the moon looks is because it doesn't have an atmosphere, so it gets impacted a lot more.
Got it.
And, of course, a lot of other reasons as well. So, just to kind of recap, we don't really know how our celestial buddy, the moon, came to be. What's that? And we don't really know what Earth was like back then, more than 4 billion years ago. But we can say with some certainty that the moon probably came from a large impactor. It seems pretty clear that that is what happened. Now, this is both because of the homogeneity, right, of the isotope ratios, and because it seems like the moon was molten at some point. Those are the two biggest pieces of evidence for this impact or giant impact hypothesis. And, of course, thankfully, scientists will be around for a long time, pondering these things, finding out the origins, and bringing that knowledge to mere mortals like us, who are not scientists and don't really know what the hell they're talking about. But I like to dig into these things sometimes. There's a lot more out there about this, of course, but I just wanted to give a little, kind of primer on it, so.
Do you still want to go to the moon?
Of course. Who wouldn't want to go to space?
I don't. I do not want to go to space.
Oh my god.
I would like to
do it so much.
I would like to maybe virtual reality space, but I don't want to actually go outside.
See, this is like
the atmosphere.
we're very much the same in a lot of ways, but this is one of the ways we're very different. Like
that is scary. You'd be so high up, and then I feel like, and I think we talked about this before, that like astronauts have like this moment where they're like,
it's true. That some people can't like psychologically handle it, and
like
you don't know before.
I feel like that would be me. I would like freak out.
You never know.
So I have a murdery.
Okay.
We got a straight up cold case here for episode 74. I'm talking about the bizarre murder or suicide of Jonathan Luna. Which is kind of funny because you just talked about the moon.
Yeah, what a weird coincidence.
Jonathan Luna. So he was born October 21st, 1965, and he grew up in the projects in the South Bronx in New York City. So he is described as generous and well-liked. He's energetic. He's selfless. His father was Filipino and his mother was African-American, and they're all very hardworking, like he beat the odds and graduated from Fordham University in 1987 with a degree in history. So he really pushed himself. And then he went on to law school, and he eventually graduated from the University of North Carolina with a law degree. So, super successful, and he began working as a prosecutor in 1997, working in Greensboro, North Carolina. He worked as a clerk for U.S. District Judge William L. Osteen, and it was there that he met his wife, Angela. So he moves on, and he starts working at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Baltimore, Maryland, as Assistant United States Attorney. So at this point, he's in Baltimore, Maryland. He moves in with his wife, Angela, just outside of Baltimore in a town called Elk Ridge, and they have 2 sons. So, before Jonathan's death, he was working on a plea bargain agreement for 2 defendants in a drug trial that he was prosecuting. So, this was a very violent drug trafficking organization, okay? So he was prosecuting a Baltimore rapper named Dion Lionel Smith and his associate, Walter O'Reilly Poindexter. So the two of them were accused of running a heroin ring outside of their recording studio, which, if I recall correctly, was called, like, Stash House Studio or something.
Not even trying to hide it.
Not even trying to hide it. The defendants did plead guilty to 3 counts of drug trafficking and some other things. So, at about 5:30 a.m. on December 3rd, 2003, Jonathan Luna's body was discovered in a rural town called Denver, Pennsylvania, in Brecknock Township. So his car was found parked behind a drilling company before being driven into the creek. His body was found by an employee named Daniel Gammon, and he was found face down in a stream underneath the car, which was still running. He had been wearing a suit and a black overcoat with his ID around his neck. Blood was found on the driver's side, and a pool of blood was found on the passenger side floor, and there was also blood in the back seat. Luna had been stabbed 36 times. Yeah. The coroner states that there were no defensive wounds. The wounds were around the chest and the neck, and a head injury was also found. There was money scattered throughout the car. There was also a blood-stained toll booth ticket, which is odd because Luna had Easy Pass. And for those who don't know, the Easy Pass is like a little plastic thing, maybe 4 inches long, that you like tape to the top of your car, and top of your windshield, and as you go through the tolls, instead of stopping and physically handing someone money, it just automatically takes it out. So he didn't really need a toll booth ticket in the first place. 2 months later, the murder weapon was found, Luna's penknife. And we don't really know why it was found 2 months later or what that whole deal was. There's a lot of unanswered questions here. There's a lot of things the FBI, things federal agents said, and things the locals say, you know. So Dr. Barry, let's get into the investigation. Dr. Barry Walp, the forensic pathologist, he said that Luna died by drowning. Despite this, anonymous federal sources told reporters in Washington, D.C. and in Baltimore that it had been suicide. And this caught on a little bit. They argued that, like, some of the wounds were shallow and called them, quote, hesitation wounds, which I guess is legitimately, like, a thing, but it's not, like, on your chest and your neck. It's, like, maybe on your wrist.
But 36 times?
Exactly. Yeah.
I don't believe that.
Right.
That seems incredible in the sense that it's not credible.
So the new coroner who took over after Barry Walp retired at the end of 2003. So he was found in the beginning of December. A month later, the coroner retires, and Dr. G. Gary Kirchner takes over, and he believes that the autopsy report was right and that it was homicide. He also talks about that he was approached by FBI agents to change the ruling, but he declined. He was like, no. He even wrote a letter to them. So he was like, okay, well, like, if you guys want to do this, he writes a letter to them asking about a coroner's inquest. And he's like, okay, you can present open court testimony on why you think Jonathan's death was a suicide. Right? But there was never...
That's how an inquest works.
There was never a response. Investigators also look into the prosecution case that Luna was dealing with at the time. So the defendants, Smith and Poindexter, were in jail at the time of the murder, and they reached a plea deal. So there wasn't really much motive there. Like during the initial hearing, but they like took a lunch break, and Jonathan went over there and was like, all right, here's a plea deal. And they accepted it. So it wasn't like a fight or anything. They looked over his financial records and his computer files. Unnamed federal sources have told the Washington Post and the Baltimore Sun that Luna was actually facing a polygraph test connected to the disappearance of $36,000 from a bank robbery case that he had prosecuted back in 2002. Coincidentally, the sources also said that Luna, quote, came into $10,000 soon before he died. So there's a little bit of question. Maybe there was some kind of motive there. Maybe he was stealing money. Maybe he wasn't. They also revealed that he had $25,000 in credit card debt that his wife didn't even know about. He had at one point like 16 credit cards open at the same time.
Oh my God.
Yeah, talk about stress,
Yeah.
right? His name was found on adult websites seeking women for sexual encounters. Some sources say that where Luna's body was found was like a common place for people to like meet up and hook up, but local authorities were like, that's not true. That's not a thing. So as they investigate, they find that Jonathan was also taking frequent trips to Philadelphia in the past few weeks. His father even talked about how he canceled a Thanksgiving trip to New York City because he had to work a case in Philadelphia. Officials say that doesn't make sense because he didn't have any work in Philadelphia, but other people who were like working on the case with him said, well, the key witness is locked up in Philadelphia. So if he's going to Philadelphia, it's because he's going there to interview the key witness. So let's go through like a timeline of his last hours. So this is December, I think it's December 2nd, and then it goes on to December 3rd. So he leaves the office at 6 p.m. to go home. But he comes back a few hours later to draw up the plea agreements, finish up some paperwork. Around 10:30, he calls the defense attorneys and says that he's going to fax over plea agreements by midnight. But that fax never came. This is also odd, he leaves his cell phone and glasses on the desk, which his friends say that he needed his glasses to drive, even. His car was clocked leaving the courthouse parking garage at 11:38 p.m. And so we know his approximate whereabouts because of the tolls. So he passes through 3 toll plazas before taking exit 3 on I-95, which lands him in Newark, Delaware. And there, at this stop, there's a $200 withdrawal from the gas station ATM at Travel Plaza at 12:57 a.m. And they're not even sure if that's Jonathan or not because the camera footage was unclear. And then money is taken out again, and the camera footage for that was also unclear, which is, I don't know what that says. This is where we have a gap in time. So about from 12:57 a.m. he withdraws the $200. And we know that at about 2:37 a.m. his car entered the New Jersey Turnpike from Route 130, which is usually a 45-minute trip, but about an hour and a half has passed. So he crosses the Delaware River Bridge, enters the Pennsylvania Turnpike about 10 minutes later. At 3:20 a.m., his card is used at another gas station. He exits again at 4:04 a.m. with a paper ticket, and that's the one that was later found in the car with bloodstains. According to the coroner, Luna was alive when his car pulled up to the creek, and he isn't found dead until 5:30 a.m. He doesn't show up for court the next morning at 9:30, but they went on with the plea agreements anyway, which is unusual. Sometime after 9:30, his credit card is used again at a shopping mall in Pennsylvania. Yeah, even though his body had already been found. So, theories. The main theory, obviously, is murder, homicide. But why? We don't really have a motive because, Jonathan was one of those classic, all around good people, worked really hard for what he had. So was there some corruption going on within the attorney's office? Maybe, maybe not. Did all this have something to do with the case that he was prosecuting? Like, the key witness was also, an FBI informant, I guess. And, at one point, he, took off his ankle bracelet and ran. And so, he was, a kind of a dangerous character. And maybe he got in trouble with someone in the heroin trade. And officials looked at previous cases that he was on, stuff that he already, closed. But they never found any promising leads. He's done a lot of drug trafficking, and, he's definitely met his, fair share of dangers.
Done a lot of drug trafficking in the sense that he's defended a lot of drug trafficking.
Right.
Okay,
right.
sorry.
Yes.
I just want to make sure that was clear.
Yes, thank you. And he's come across plenty of, like, pretty dangerous people, but
Right.
they didn't really find anything.
Nothing specific.
Nothing specific. Or suicide. I mean, I don't really want to entertain the idea.
Seems pretty far-fetched.
I know. And, I mean, I guess you could say he was in so much debt, like, he felt like somebody did say that he felt like he was going to get fired, but his coworkers deny that's not true. Note that we don't know how the killer got away. Maybe there were 2 cars. So there's still, like, a lot of questions here, like, why do the federal agents think that Luna killed himself? Like, why didn't they... It doesn't make sense for them to look at something so obvious and say it's a suicide. What's going on there?
What are they trying to hide?
Right. There was also a lot of suggestions of racism and prejudice, and that's could be a factor too,
Yeah, I mean, Baltimore is historically a very racist town.
Yes. Why was there an hour-and-a-half time gap? What happened during that time? Why was his Easy Pass used on Interstate 95 into Delaware, but not on the New Jersey and Pennsylvania turnpikes? Why didn't he finish the plea agreement that night? Was he interrupted? So to me, it seems like somebody picked him up at his office, like held a gun to his head and told him to drive. That's what it seems like to me.
I agree.
Until one point they killed him and they dropped him off. We have no idea who or no idea why. The FBI is offering a $100,000 reward for any information leading to the resolution of the investigation. Got anything?
What?
Know anybody?
Oh, no. Sorry, I've never heard of this case before.
Wild, right?
It is pretty crazy, but I agree that that's what it seems like happened. Sometime after 11:38 or whatever around that time, he was abducted, essentially.
Right. And they found blood stains in the back seat.
Yeah, so maybe he was even, bludgeoned at that time, and he was just, like, taken out to his car, killed somewhere else, and then taken to that site, but...
Maybe that's what that hour-and-a-half gap is.
The one thing that does not seem to... I don't know, it just doesn't seem like suicide. No. But it's good mystery. There's a lot of mystery there. Okay, so we're gonna do
time to move on?
Little bit
For weird
shit
in the news. I don't know why I'm saying it so slow.
In the news.
Okay, I don't have one, but you said you had a good one.
I meant to do this one last week because it's a little bit old, but So we all know Arnold Schwarzenegger, right?
Yes.
Arnold. And so if you know anything about Arnold Schwarzenegger, he's a big, muscly man, 71 years old at this time, and he was recently and this is a BBC News article about this, but there's like a bunch of them out there.
You're watching the BBC.
So he was at his event recently called Arnold Classic Africa, which is a sporting event he I guess hosts every year, and this guy thought he was going to be a big badass guy, and he goes up and he decides he's gonna kick Mr. Arnold Schwarzenegger, right? So he comes at Arnold with a flying kick, and this guy thought he was gonna be, whatever. He was gonna take down Arnold. He did not.
Surprise attack!
He did not take down Arnold with his surprise attack. Arnold Schwarzenegger didn't even realize he had been kicked. He thought he had been jostled by the crowd, and literally was not aware that something like this had happened until he watched the video of it, which you can go and watch. It's out. But Arnold says if you watch a video, just keep in mind it's not about the attacker, it's about the people competing at his event.
Yes.
He's trying to put that all back onto them, because that's what it's about. But it was just a pretty funny, kind of story. But like you really think you're gonna come at Arnold Schwarzenegger?
Like
I don't care that he's 71 years old. He'd kick your ass.
It's like when a puppy bites at your ankles.
No, it's like when a puppy runs at a car.
Yeah, that's a better.
You have no chance. So anyway, that's what I got. So thanks for listening, you guys.
Yay. Hey.
74 weeks, going strong.
Hey, 74.
We want to keep making this
weeks.
better, doing more research,
Right,
getting more
right.
into stuff, bringing you guys the, interesting, diverse stories.
Yes.
With that,
We're trying.
humanistic, angle that we try to do.
We're trying to step our game up.
You got any ways to make it better? Suggestions?
Review us on iTunes.
We recently got an email. A very nice lady said she, maybe she would send us her ghost story. If you have a ghost story, if you got a mystery,
If you have any stories, send it to us. What's our email? mysterymurderythingy@gmail.com.
mysterymurderythingy@gmail.com.
Follow us on Twitter, Facebook.
Mario Text 30 is my
Instagram.
Twitter. I try to tweet helpful, interesting stuff. Apparently, they're going to change the way that pork is being in. Don't buy pork. That's one thing I would suggest. Apparently, they're changing the way it's going to be inspected.
Look it up.
Look it up. Okay, thanks, guys.